it's Richard here from Accelerants, and welcome to the second in this brand new podcast series called Game Changers. Last week we spoke to Olympic gold medalist Anna Watkins, and this week I'm delighted to introduce SaaS superstar, serial founder, serial investor, and all-round good guy, Gary Stewart. Hi, Gary.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for joining us, and thank you for doing this. This podcast series is all about diving into the similarities in hyper performance between leading sports people and leading people in the world of technology, of which you are one, par excellence. And so what I'm looking for really is a kind of a common genome, a common DNA, a common thread, the center of the Venn diagram between sports and technology, to find out what you guys all have in common, because what you guys have done is extraordinary. I thought we'd kick off, if that's all right, it's a rather grey and rainy day here, by taking us back to Jamaica, where it all began, and tell us a little bit about your early life and your family.
Yeah, no, so awesome. So born in Jamaica, 1974. I don't know if I should say that publicly. And don't remember that much about the early years, because we left by the time I was about 5 years old, to move to New York. So, my parents, my mother in particular, decided that we would have a better life in New York. So we kind of immigrated, lived, all of us in a 1-bedroom while they kind of really got their feet, on the ground. Eventually they would kind of buy a place, but we grew up in the Bronx. So it was kind of a nice, working class background in the Bronx, and then they eventually would work their way up over the time period. So the American dream does exist, but, definitely for most of the time when I was a young kid, when you're young, you don't even know what the Bronx is. So it's kind of so it wasn't it was I didn't know what Manhattan was either, other than on TV. So it wasn't I had this thing or the sense of loss. It was kind of oh, this is cool. This is where I live and all that kind of stuff. And the really cool thing though was that during the summers, they would send us back to Jamaica. So it was we would go back and the family there, we would have summer camps. My aunt would organize summer camps. And then it would be we would be playing tennis, we'd be swimming, they would take us fishing. So you had this kind of juxtaposition of this life where in the US, you're an immigrant. But then luckily, I think for me, this other life where it's you can live in a place where you're not kind of the foreigner or the weird one. You're just kind of part of the majority, and then you can just be yourself. And then on top of it, my family was really cool, my aunts and uncles, and they took really good care of us. And we would never want to come back to New York at the end of the summers. But eventually my parents, by the time I got to be about 12, they were it's time for you to get a job. So I had to kind of then start working at the local pharmacy, because they wanted, and even when we were growing up, I had a paper route. So I'd have to get up every morning at 6 o'clock before school or whatever, and kind of go deliver the daily news or whatever it was to all these people who kind of had paid. And then we'd have to go once a week and collect the money. And then my father in particular would come with us to make sure we didn't no one try to take advantage of us. But we were young kids, 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, going out there delivering papers and then collecting money. And then eventually I had to get a real job.
It wasn't like the arcade game where you had to sort of throw the newspapers onto the front lawn. I'm guessing in the Bronx, it was a slightly different way of delivering newspapers, was it?
Yeah, no, it was kind of you had to put it in the mailbox, or you had to put it through the little, letter thing. And so that's what we did. I mean, if someone had a dog, then you'd be a little bit nervous. But, the part of the Bronx that we lived in, everyone had a house. So it wasn't kind of it wasn't a brownstone, but, it was people who were kind of just working class people, but they still kind of had, 2-family households for the most part, and they were working hard. It's just that they, for whatever reason, weren't kind of the 1%.
Yeah. And how important was education to your mum and dad? Was it something they drilled into you? Tell me about school.
Yeah, no. So I think that I started school in Jamaica when I was 3 years old. So by the time I got to America, they said I was about 2 or 3 years ahead of other kids my age. And they made me take a test, and they were he's gifted. So they were they put me in all of these gifted classes. They told my parents potentially I'd be able to skip classes or grades. And my parents, my mother in particular, didn't want me to do that because she didn't want me to be a freak. So she kind of basically said, no, you're going to be like a normal kid and you just have to like, you know, and yeah, so school was really, really important. It was something that I did well at from a very early age. Like my aunt in particular. So my father is the youngest of 12 kids, and my aunt was
Wow.
like 20, 30 years older than he was. So something like that. And she was like, she worked for the Department of Education in Jamaica in a very senior position. So she wrote books. She had her PhD. She wrote books about it. She made us like, everyone was like super hyper British, or at least she was, you know, so it was like, we had to like eat properly and we had to speak properly and we had to read her books and all that kind of stuff. But it was fun for me because I was a good student. So it was something that like I looked forward to, like learning more. And I think once my parents saw that like I was a good student, then they kind of, and then my aunt as well, then they made it like really easy for me to just focus on education. They were always pushing me. But the good thing is like I didn't really need to be pushed. I wasn't one of those kids where it was like, you should go study. It was like, leave me alone, I have to study. You know, that
Yeah.
was kind of like more of my approach.
Yeah. We talked earlier and about your on a previous call about a family motto that your father had. Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, it was my father's sister. Like, not this was like, so this was his sister who's only like 5 years older than he is. So she was like closer to his age. And when we would go back, we would normally stay with her, my auntie Joy, and she would say, you know, because she was really worried that in New York we would start to lose our sense of identity. And
Mm.
so she was like, you know, just remember when you go back home that you're as good as any, better than many, and inferior to none. And I think it was really kind of like, I didn't understand it at that point. Later, I would tell people it felt like brainwashing, but it was like, just remember who you are and what you can do, and don't let anybody ever tell you that you're less than. And I
Yeah.
feel like, you know, that is a really important lesson to have, because I think that when you're growing up in New York and in the Bronx and you're an immigrant kid, because, you know, it wasn't only, there's not only like racism. Like I remember like one time when I was in junior high school, it must have been, you know, they had like everyone bring your local foods or whatever. And my mother made some like curry goat. And then all the kids were like, what's that green stuff that he's eating? You know, and they were like, he's a this and he's a that. And these were like, you know, Black and Latino kids. So it was like, there's always someone trying to make you feel like an other. And I guess I had various reasons to feel like an other, even in, you know, minority communities. And so my aunt was always just like, just remember, you're as good as any, better than many, and inferior to none. And I guess, you know, maybe some people would say it gave me like a bulletproof ego, but it was really, really useful.
What a wonderful message for an aunt to pass down to a nephew. That should be written in big letters on you know, every study wall, shouldn't it? Really. Yeah. I'm fascinated to know what life was like. I'm guessing sort of mid-80s in the Bronx. You know, as a Jamaican. You know, how challenging was that, or wasn't it? You know, what was life like growing up?
It was really interesting. I mean, I feel like, you know, there are always opportunities if you're willing to look for them, right? So it was like in New York, I guess maybe, or maybe in the US more generally, there's something called the USTA, the US Tennis Association. And so they would kind of go and look for kids in all of the different neighborhoods to teach them how to play tennis. So, you know, during the summers, like, you know, if I wasn't working, I'd go play tennis because they were like literally trying to teach, you know, minority kids how to play tennis. And when I was in high school, you know, I went to like a specialized high school. So New York has, you know, 2 or 3 schools that are like top public schools. You have to take a test to get in. And I got into those. And then, you know, my friends were like from all over the spectrum. They were like, you know, I met like for the first time, like Asian people. And I met for the first time, like Middle Eastern people. But at that time, I didn't know they were Asian or Middle Eastern. I just knew they looked different from me. So it was kind of like this whole process of kind of like your world expanding. But I never felt like limited by the place that I was growing up, because there was always a way to kind of find something else. I mean, not everybody, most of the kids would be playing basketball and I'd be playing tennis. And I told my parents, you have to go buy me a tennis racket, you know, but it reminds me of the story that I read last week, this like kid in New York, a Nigerian kid. And he was like 8 years old or 7 years old. And he was like homeless. And he went to his school, public school, and he saw a chess board and he was like, what's that? And, you know, a teacher taught him chess. And at that point, he wasn't really good at it. But then all of a sudden I read the paper, and 2 years later, he's like one of the youngest ever national chess champions in America. And he's like, my goal is to be the youngest ever grandmaster. Right. And I was like, but he was homeless and he was like basically just saw the chess. And I think that's the thing. Like, I never ever saw limitations. I was like, I can do whatever I want to do. And I always wanted to do the stuff that was like the hardest to do or the most fun to do, like tennis. I just said, I want to play tennis. I want to be like those sorts of people. And so I learned tennis. And so I didn't really limit myself by my surroundings.
There's a similarity here already in the stories and the conversations I've had about, knowing no boundaries is one thing, but also having the curiosity to follow up on that, to go and explore other areas where, so many of the rest of us just stay within the confines and the comfort of what we know. Was that something you were conscious of when you were younger? Was it taught, or was it in you?
I think it was in me, the curiosity, because my mother, I was talking to her the other day, and she was telling some story about like how she went from one place to the other. She's like, but you won't know because your head is always in a book, So it was kind of like, even when I was growing up, like the rest of the world didn't exist to me. I would always be reading. There was one summer where we drove to Disney World, and it was like, I think like 24 hours in total from like New York to like Florida, whatever. I was reading the whole way. Right. So like my head was always somewhere else. I never ever, And I think like kind of like education and books and stuff like that meant that like, I remember reading Pride and Prejudice, and I was like, some little Black kid in the Bronx. And I thought it was like so awesome. Like I read it twice. Like I literally, that's the only time I read a book, and then I finished it. And I was like, I didn't want this to end. So I started from page 1 and just read it again. And I felt like, that kind of opened up all these new worlds, so that like, I wanted to see these worlds. I mean, maybe that's part of the reason that afterwards I eventually left the US and then kind of traveled around the world, because I wanted to see the stuff I was reading about. And so I think that curiosity, part of it, comes from education, but I think part of it comes from positive reinforcement as well. People telling you that you're good at stuff. And then you see, oh, when I try something out, usually doesn't end up too badly. So it's not like there's not a tremendous amount of risk involved, but the reward is really great because I usually have a good time and I feel like, oh, I learned something, and that makes me feel happy.
Yeah. What else is another similarity I've spotted is outside influences on you guys, in your early years, who come to you or come to your family. When we spoke before, you mentioned a teacher. Is it Mr. Riccardi was his name? Yes. Where you were in a free school, and he came to your mum and gave her a message, didn't he?
Yeah, no, it's actually, it was a private school, because my mom, because I was like, smart or whatever, decided that she wanted to put me in a private school. So they were actually paying for, me to go to this school. And Mr. Riccardi, and we had to wear like uniforms and stuff like that, even though I don't know why. But like Mr. Riccardi, in one of the parent teacher meetings, he said to my mother, oh, he's really smart. Like, you need to get him out of here. And so she probably thought, I'm doing a good job. I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to get him like, not into public schools. I'm trying to put him in a private school. And he was like, no, actually, there's a public school called Bronx High School of Science. And they have like, Nobel Peace Prize winners and this and that. And it's a really good school, one of the best in New York City. You just have to take a test. And I think he could pass a test. He should take it. And, I wrote this on Facebook the other day. My mother was like, no, I knew about the school. But I was like, then how come no one told me to study? Because like literally, like the next weekend I was there taking a test, and luckily I passed it, but yeah, I didn't know that I was supposed to take that test. I just kind of told I had to be at a place at a given time. And in my recollection, despite what my mother says, it was all because of Mr. Riccardi, because he was like, your kid is going to become like a class clown because the other kids are pressuring him to fit in, and he doesn't fit in. So you need to give him an outlet where it's okay for him to be weird. It's okay for him to be smart, or he's going to waste his potential. And so that was kind of Mr. Riccardi's intervention.
It's okay to be weird. It's okay to be smart. It's something that resonates a lot, doesn't it, in sort of today's world in technology. It resonates with Steve Jobs. Bring us your weird, bring us your strange, bring us your, your uncommon. So Bronx Science, I think I'm right in saying, is that when the debating started and you were beginning your kind of debating career at that point?
Yeah, so I didn't know anything about debating or whatever. I mean, and like I was one of these little kids where like, the little Black kid from the Bronx, all of a sudden I told my parents, I want a briefcase, because I wanted, it's like I would see something and I would like visualize it. So it was like, get me a tennis racket. Like I want a briefcase, because I had to take, my little, I had to get like a little file, one of those portfolio things, and you want to open up your briefcase. But I got into debate because on the first day that I can remember anyway of high school, I met this other kid, Ragi, and he was like my best friend in high school. He tells a story that I forced him. I saw something and I was like, hey, I think I want to be a lawyer. So let's go to join the debate team. And we didn't know anything about it, but we kind of saw it and we're like, wow, it looks interesting. And so we tried out, we made the debate team. And then eventually, like, I think I became New York City debate champion and then went to the national championships. That one didn't go as well as I would like, but kind of, was recognized as kind of like a top debater in New York. And again, I didn't see any of the limitations of like, oh, well, you're the only Black kid in this, exercise or whatever, or you won and you're Black. It was kind of like, I saw people doing something that I thought was cool. And I was like, well, I think I can do that. I think I can do it well. I just need a briefcase and a little suit. Now, when I look back on the little suits, because you had to actually wear a suit and a tie and stuff like that, you had to go to we would go to Mid-Manhattan Library. So that was like really the first time I went to Manhattan by myself, because that was the big research library. And you'd be reading John Rawls and Kant and stuff like that. And I didn't know who these people were, but I just knew that I would watch other people and they were quoting, these people. And I was like, well, I have to learn this stuff too. So that was how I kind of got into debate. And then I realized, apparently I was good at it. And then it kind of just opened other doors, because eventually I became president of my high school. Because I saw the people who were president of the high school before me, and I was like, or the executives, and I was like, I think I can do that. So then I ran, and then I won. Didn't like the job as much as I thought, because it was like a lot of work. But I think that the thing is, I would just always see stuff, and then I was like, oh, I think I can do that. And then I would kind of like arm myself for it, like whether it's you need the tennis racket or the briefcase or whatever. And then eventually, kind of you have to like perform it, I guess. And then eventually, like and you have to visualize yourself being able to do it. And then lo and behold, I would do it and it would turn out okay. And then that kind of like affirms and reaffirms that you can take these sorts of risks, right? Like you're not going to usually fall flat on your face. And even if you do, you'll get over it.
Yeah, it's not the end of the world. Yeah,
it's not the end of the world.
It was in a debate. I'm going to say the name Charles Murray to you. It was in a debate that somebody called Charles Murray. Tell me about Charles Murray and what his what the impact of his story on your life.
Yeah, no. So it was like, now I was at Yale, and it must have been my second year. And Yale is a great place. Like I love Yale, but all of a sudden they were bringing this guy to campus. Charles Murray is a professor. I think he's a professor at University of Chicago, or he was some university. And he had written a book, he wrote a book called The Bell Curve. And the bell curve basically argues for the genetic inferiority of Black people, right? And it's supposed to be kind of like a really data-driven scientific study as to why Black people, where one of the key conclusions is that Black people are kind of like genetically inferior, that there's a bell curve of like intelligence, and statistically Black people are at the lower end of it. And I was just like, I didn't come to Yale for this. So I was just like, this is not really a kind of very welcoming environment. What do you think the Black kids are going to feel having this guy on campus? And so then the university administration was like, well, he's an academic, he's a serious academic, like we can't stifle free speech. And so like what that led me to do is say, well, that's fine. I think I'm going to create an organization as well. And maybe I'm going to invite people that you disagree with. And they were like, okay, and we'll give you the money for it. And I was like, really? And they were like, yeah. So then we organized the event. We partnered with the university. I got people to come, like Desmond Tutu. Well, I partnered with him. I got Jesse Jackson, and like any sort of speaker that was kind of like saying something that I thought was important to Black communities or to minority communities, but they weren't being invited to Yale's campus. Like Al Sharpton, was huge in New York, but he had never been invited to Yale. Like all of the Black Panthers, not all of them, but various of the members of the Black Panther Party had never been invited to Yale. So we invited them, because we're like, well, it's true that free speech is really important, but it can't just be free speech for one limited segment of the population. It has to be a full discourse of ideas. And I'm going to make sure that some of the voices from people that look like me are represented. And that's what we did. And it turned out to be a tremendous success. Like there's a guy who's the head of the Democratic National Committee right now, his name is Jamie Harrison. He was actually the third president of the organization that I founded. So we're always talking about like WPF. But yeah, I think that was the lesson there, was if you see a problem and you think you can solve it, solve it. Right. Yeah. I think it goes back to kind of the lesson that we're saying before. Like I usually see myself like being able to do what I set my mind to. I just have to decide to do it. And then I'm not usually that afraid of trying it out. And then I just tried it out and it's successful. And then the next time I can be even more audacious, I think. I think like over the course of my life, I keep taking bigger and bigger risks because I've seen that like even when they don't fully pay off, they always open the door to something else that's even bigger and better. So it's kind of like, yeah. And that was kind of the first time I did that at Yale because I didn't know how the campus was going to respond. I didn't do any of this user validation to figure out whether the community, I just said, I'm going to do this. University gave me money. And I just started inviting people. And lo and behold, it was a success.
It's like the innocence of youth, though, isn't it? When you don't know, it's like, I don't know if you've ever been skiing or something like that, but when you see people, you know, the first day they go out and they're bombing down the slopes, they're like 7 years old, they would take you, and it's like they don't know that it hurts when you fall over. And I wonder if that's a kind of good analogy for, you know, for what you were doing, which was sort of pushing the boundaries and seeing where you got told to stop or get off.
Well, actually, it's funny. When I went skiing for the first time, I think I must have been like 30, and like my friends were, and my partner at the time, they were like Spanish and they were like, you know, some of these kids who had grown up skiing. And so they took me to the top of like a double black diamond and like, okay, Gary, just go down slowly. And I was like, in my head, I just saw like the Olympic skiers. I was like, because I was just basically like, all you have to do is what you saw on TV. And then the only problem is when it started to go too fast, I didn't know how to stop. So I just like dived into the snow. So that was kind of like my only way of stopping. And eventually they taught me like how to turn and all that kind of stuff. But I think even there, but the flip side of that is that eventually, because I guess like I'm okay with risk and kind of just trying stuff out. I stopped skiing though when Sonny Bono died, and then when Michael Schumacher, then it was like, whoa, this is for real. Because like the risk was hypothetical until that point. Once the risk became mortal, then I was just like, I think I'm like, I felt really lucky that I didn't end up badly. So it's kind of, it's really interesting in the relationship with risk. It's kind of like, in my head, everything always works out until someone reminds me that, well, sometimes it doesn't. And then you're like, okay, maybe you need to recalibrate.
So that there's a visualization there, isn't there, of success in the sense of, you know, when you're skiing, you'd seen it on TV. I've heard of, you know, golfers who can just hit a golf ball by just visualizing how they've seen someone else do it and then just replicate that. You have some kind of DNA that's the visualizing what great looks like and then, you know, getting on with it, irrespective of kind of the potential it might not work.
Yeah, it's true. Like I do visualize a lot of stuff. Like, you know, maybe it's delusions, who knows? But like at least in my head, it's like usually you can kind of see how it's supposed to play out, and you can even probably see how it plays out like a step or two ahead, right? Because I think like I'm also kind of like, okay, so this could happen, but then this is how you mitigate it. Okay, but this, so it's almost like you're having a conversation with yourself, and you're kind of visualizing not just like the next step, but like the next step or two. And then I think being able to see the step after the step then means that you can mitigate the risks of that first step. So it's kind of like, I think that's been something that's been really useful to kind of just think 2 or 3 steps ahead and be like, oh no, that's not really going to be a very good result for you. And you can't really mitigate the risk that well. So probably shouldn't do it. Except for skiing, you know, I kind of figured out like, you know, I saw that they were able to pick people off of those, you know, and they took them to like drink or stuff. So I was like, okay, that's the worst that can happen. It wasn't until I was like, no, death is actually a possibility as well, that I kind of said, you haven't quite analyzed that one correctly.
And enough of the sports analogies, but I know in snooker, they do the same thing. In pool, they do the same thing. They play each shot 3 points at 3 shots ahead, 4 shots ahead, knowing where the cue ball is going to be and where, you know, and there's a real lesson in life there, isn't it? Which is just don't play that shot, but think about, you know, what would need to happen with shot 2, shot 3, and shot 4, and that maps really well into a sort of technical SaaS model as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think like for entrepreneurs, that's like a really good skill. Because sometimes when I hire people now for my team, like I'm always looking to see, can this person just, I mean, like I was watching this video with Elon Musk, a TED Talk, or it was like, well, it wasn't really a TED Talk, it was like a TED interview. And, you know, the interview at the end, they were like, well, what is it about this guy that makes him so special? He keeps creating new businesses. And they were like, that's because he can go back to first principles. Like a lot of other people, they're just kind of repeating what they've seen without really thinking about kind of the logic, the internal logic of what they're doing. But I think like really great entrepreneurs and people who are kind of more visionary, they can kind of like, think it through, like, okay, let's go back to the original. Let's really understand what's going on, and then let's figure out how this can play out. And I feel like if you can just analyze it a little bit more deeply, usually it's you're able to go a little bit farther, right? As opposed to people who are just kind of going through the motions or doing things without thinking like why they're doing them or what can go wrong.
On last week's podcast, I talked to Anna Watkins, who won Olympic gold medal in the double sculls at London. And she was telling us how she used to analyze the data that they used to get from the oars, from rowing, that would show the power and the depth. And maybe unlike, and maybe unlike her peers, she really dived into the analysis and thought deeply about the data and the models, so that when she was back on the water, she knew what a stroke would feel like. That would be the perfect power stroke, on the data when it came out. And if she could then marry that up to, how it felt on the boat and pass it on to fellow teammates, she found that invaluable. So that's a really interesting hookup. You see the deep thinking and the deep analysis and the, playing more than one step ahead of the game. That's something you look for in new entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is I think that if you kind of really analyze it properly, then it means that you're not as afraid. Because I think that the thing that kind of really stops most people is fear. So I was listening to a really great podcast, Masters of Scale with Reid Hoffman. And I forget, it was a woman, Linda Rottenberg, who created Endeavor. And she was saying, first thing, when she was just graduated from Yale Law School, she went to Harvard undergraduate. So, pretty, and her parents were basically like, don't go into this entrepreneurship stuff. You need to have a stable job. And she was like, so many good ideas, so many great ambitions are killed in the shower. People just saying, I don't think I can. Right. And I think that's the point. If you think you can't, you won't. So I think that sometimes if you think you can, and you kind of really have done the analysis to understand it is actually possible, and I believe in myself enough to be able to do it, then you don't have that paralyzing fear that I think debilitates a lot of people. Because a lot of people, even if they wanted to, they kind of stop. And I see this with founders and some people who work for me as well. It's like they start looking like a deer in headlights. It's like they can't really get out of their own way. And I feel like the luxury of being able to visualize it and see, oh, this is how it plays out, and oh, it's not really that big of a deal, and I believe in myself, is that you just don't get paralyzed with fear or stop doing things because you're worried about the consequences. It's a certain sort of freedom to just do.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Again, Anna was saying that when she got scared, she went back to her analysis. She knew that if she went at this stroke rate with this stroke, that she would be there or thereabouts at the end. And then it was just down to who had the biggest heart and who wanted it most. And when you were talking then, I was reflecting on your good friend of mine, Chris Topman, who I first started working with in 1995 when we were a lot younger and certainly in my case thinner in those days. But Chris used to hand out Jonathan Livingston Seagull, the book, whose key phrase is "You can if you think you can." To all new trainees, as day one, you'd get Jonathan Livingston Seagull on your desk as a kind of motto for life, and it just shows that so much of this is about visualizing success and then not doubting, and if you doubt, go back to your analysis and keep going.
Yeah, and I think for the stuff that's really important to me, it's also about role modeling. Because a part of it that's been really useful to me is whenever I have those doubts as well, there's always been someone, and it doesn't always have to be a Black person or a man or whatever, just someone that says, hey, you can do this, whether it's my aunt or Mr. Riccardi, or when I was at Yale, a guy named Paul Frimmer. I told you the story about how I was worried that, I wasn't going to be a good student because now I would compete with all the fancy kids and their Porsches who laughed at me when I said Saint Tropez instead of Saint Tropez because I didn't know Saint Tropez. I was just reading it phonetically. So you could kind of start to doubt yourself, but then I always had people who were like, you could do this, you got this, and they weren't doing it in a kind of charity way. It was they would evaluate my work and they're like, wow, okay, you're pretty good. And you're like, really? And you're like, yeah. And because you do need that every now and then, that kind of positive reinforcement. And I think my parents were obviously, and my aunts were a big source of the positive reinforcement. And then over time, I've just always had people be really generous in terms of supporting me. And I think that's part of the reason why I also pay it forward, right? Because I also feel because I've had that, I also try to kind of pay it forward. And then I believe that I am really lucky in life because karma favors those who help others, right? So it's kind of my larger thinking. If I help other people, then other people will help me. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way, but at least for me to get to this point, it had to work that way, because certainly there's no other reason why I would have gotten here.
I don't know whether you've seen on Netflix, there's a series called Last Chance U, which is all about a bunch of kids playing American football. And it's about East Mississippi Community College, easy for me to say, which is basically a college where they've collected in kids who maybe have made bad decisions, were very good at football, and came through high school and were brilliant and clearly very talented. If listeners haven't seen Last Chance U, it's a brilliant series. The reason I'm bringing it up is because these kids are brilliant at American football. You can tell their talent. Some of them are man mountains. A kid there called DJ Law. And there is a question coming in a minute, I promise you. But what struck me when I watched it, I was thinking about chatting to you. I was watching it last night. What struck me when I was watching it was there were people on the touchlines telling these kids they were brilliant. And they clearly were. One of them was a quarterback, scored 6 touchdowns in the first half of a game. And there were people on the touchlines. It was they had a brilliant environment, ecosystem around them. And they were encouraging. And they even had, what do you call them, scouts from the big universities, watching them. And clearly progress was being made. And yet somehow, and this is the difference, Gary, I think, between you and Anna and others, when someone comes to see you and says, you're great, you should try this and try that, you guys hear it, listen to it, and go and do it. These kids who are, to any amateur, you can tell, are clearly gifted sports people. For some reason, didn't hear it, couldn't hear it, didn't want to hear it. The more they were heard it, the more frightened they got that if they were that good, they'd fail. Does that story resonate with you at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, like, I was trying to think how I would analyze this. I think I've been really lucky with my family, but I would say that I've definitely seen cases. I do think it's cultural as well. So I hope I don't get into too much controversy here, but hopefully that's a good thing. Being outside of the US, I've seen that, like, what there is in the US is definitely this kind of like can-do culture. And I think that being an immigrant and seeing my parents leave Jamaica and then seeing it worked out for them, at the end of the day, they got the big house, they got the 6-figure salaries. It just required like a kind of dedication. My mother went back and got her degrees, her masters and everything. So you saw that, like, as long as you put the work in, like, then it could happen. I think the thing that I worry about in Europe is that sometimes you don't see that. Like, you don't see people have so much more than, like, probably a lot of people in America. But I think, like, in America, like, you have this real hunger, which is both good and bad, because it's like, if you fail, you're considered a loser and it's personal. It's not systemic. If you fail, you're a loser. And because we're the greatest country in the world, so how could you possibly fail? That's kind of the way it's taught to you. So failure is personal. And I feel like here, failure is protected. Like, you can't really fail because the system has been set up so that it's not set up for the high achieving person, it's set up for the low achieving person. And so I kind of feel that, like, what I see when I lived in Spain, for example, is people wouldn't try that hard. You would see people who are really smart. And I remember, like, when I was in Spain and I was kind of like single or whatever, people would kind of like put themselves on the chat. They'd be like, soy normalito, like, I'm normal. And I was like, why would you ever try and advertise yourself as normal? Like, I mean, I'm like hot, like, I got a great body, like, whatever it is, like, and it was just like, I'm sure, like, and that was the thing, like, at one point someone said to me, you really think you're hot, aren't you? And I was like, yeah, I do. Because the thing is, I'm like, if I don't believe it, why is anybody else going to believe it? And I feel like the thing is that, like, Americans, sometimes too much though, can be very self-confident. But I feel like if you don't have the confidence to believe in yourself, no one else is going to believe in you. And I feel like what you see in some other cultures, like Spain is one of them, probably less so in the UK, is that people don't actually allow themselves to believe that they can be superlative, right? Like, I think America penalizes anyone that's not superlative because the system is set up for outsized success if you are superlative and really harsh penalties if you're not. Whereas here, the system is set up so that no one really has to try that hard. And I think that what that means is that, like, people who do try that hard are then penalized for being too ambitious. I when I came to Europe, I was like, what does it mean to be too ambitious? Like, that just did not compute. You know what I mean?
when you're taught in America that you live in the greatest country in the world, and that's indoctrinated into you from from birth. The difference in the UK is we spend a lot of our time bashing our country, laughing at our country, criticizing our country, and also being kind of envious is the right word, but and I know they have the same thing in the States with the National Enquirer and stuff, but we spent a long time building up heroes in this country, only to knock them down. Where I think in other cultures, heroes are heroes, for a reason, and are respected as such. There's a big difference there between the UK and the US. You graduated magna cum laude from Yale. I'm not going to go through your law career. Extraordinary. I'd love to hear more about Barcelona. What was your time like living and working out in Barcelona?
I think the thing about Barcelona was it was really kind of like it reinforced my confidence, but in a kind of unexpected way, because when I went to Spain, for whatever reason, people didn't know what Yale was, right? So I think that it was really great to be like in my early 20s and not have that crutch of I went to these schools or magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. No one knew what that meant. So all of a sudden I had to become Gary, like without all of the badges again. And I think that was really useful, like in my 20s, to just have to kind of prove that I could do it without all of those networks. It's weird. I didn't really engage with the Yale community until COVID, because like I wasn't physically there anymore. So I would go to my reunions, but I wasn't really hanging out and, seeing my friends that often, maybe if they came to Barcelona or whatever. And Barcelona isn't London, and I was there for 14 years. So I was just like disconnected. It was like that Gabriel Garcia Marquez book about 100 Days of Solitude or whatever it is. I just felt like I was on this perfect little island away from everybody else. And, every now and then they might remember there was that kid, Gary, that we went to school with. Some people were like, what happened to you? Why'd you run away? And I was like, I didn't run away. But it was like, for me, it was really great to kind of find out who I was without everybody else's expectations. And then what I found out is that that turned out to be useful as I got older, because what I said to myself is, I need to figure out who I am. Not what I can do, but who I am, right? And that meant coming out of the closet and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I had to do it in a way that I wasn't, again, afraid to fail. So what I said to people when I went to Spain is, I'd rather have a quarter life crisis than a midlife crisis. I'm like, this is going to get messy. You know what I mean? But I'd rather be messy at 25 than at 45. And so I planned it out. I was like, you're going to deal with all this stuff now, because later on, you can't be middle-aged and be worrying about who you are. If you don't know who you are at that point, it's not as problematic. It's much more problematic than if you don't know at 25.
Sure. After the law, obviously the law career, Wira came along, and you can read those stories. Your success there. I think you've got 185 companies with $1.5 billion worth of value through this. But I'd really like to talk about founder tribes and what it means to you and where founder tribes came from. Tell me about that dream and that vision and how that's manifested itself.
Yeah, so founder tribes came from leaving Spain and then coming to London and seeing Black people again for the first time in 14 years. And I was walking down the street and I was speaking in English, and in Spain, speaking in English was a superpower, because it was no one knew what I was saying, or at least the average person. So I was walking down the street talking to my mother, and I was like, Mommy, there are a lot of Black people here. And all the Black people were looking at me like, doesn't he know he's Black too? So it was just kind of all of a sudden, I was like, whoa. So then in 2015, I came in 2014. I was like, okay, I'm going to figure out how this ecosystem works. And so, of course, I'm going to study it. So we commissioned a study to figure out what the startup ecosystem looks like, who's it made up of, whatever. Because in the UK, I saw that there were more interracial couples, whereas in the US, that's almost, at least when I was growing up, it was forbidden. Not just not legally, but it just didn't happen. And so I kind of wanted to figure out well, is the UK a bit, more tolerant? And how does this then reflect in kind of who gets invested and stuff like that? And so what it looked like is that on a social basis, it's definitely the case that the UK is more tolerant, but then in terms of who gets funded, not so much. And then I also looked at geography, gender, all that sort of stuff. Anyway, from that, we got published in the Wall Street Journal, CBS News came, and then people like Sol Campbell came, because they were like, whoa, you're talking about this diversity stuff. Because I didn't realize at that point people don't always talk about these things in the UK. So I was talking about it, and it was getting published. And so, the mayor, now the MP from Oldham came, and he's like, would you set up a YRET in Oldham? So all of that led to like a lot of like learnings. Then the GCHQ came, then we opened up something in Haringey. And then I think I started to realize that that's where my passion was, which is I feel like I've been really lucky in the sense that like some people would say you came from nothing and you were able to like end up hanging out with Prince Andrew when it was still okay to say that publicly. So it was like, I'm like, I feel like other people can be given the same opportunity as long as someone teaches them the rules and provide them with the equipment. Maybe the same way that I had I had to get my tennis racket and my briefcase and I had to learn the rules. I feel like those sorts of things can be taught to other people, and technology allows us to do it much more efficiently. So that's what Founder Tribes effectively is. It's like a platform that says the reason that more entrepreneurs aren't female, or at least they get funding, aren't female or minority, is not because they're dumber in the Charles Murray sense of the way of viewing the world. It's more that they lack access to understanding the rules of the game. So like they think the game is checkers, but it's really chess. And you're not going to win the game if you don't know what it is. So you have to know the rules of the game. And then you have to have someone who's going to mentor you through the game. And then eventually, if it turns out that you're actually a good player, you're going to need someone that's going to encourage you, like I've been encouraged, but that's going to be in the form of capital, right? Because that's the lifeblood of companies. And so Founder Tribes provides people with access to, the feedback. This is where you're going wrong. The mentorship. Okay, let's figure out how we can give you a good plan to get to where you want to go. And then eventually access to the people with the money, because a lot of times if you don't have the relationships, no matter how brilliant your idea is, you're not going to get funded. Like you need the warm intro. And what I've said is, for good or for bad, I have the network now that I can be the warm intro for people. And so that's what I'm trying to do in my life, like level the playing field for entrepreneurs, not just by race. Because I think people think it's because it's all Black because I'm Black. Yeah, of course, that's important to me. But I'm also gay, so LGBTQ. Women, are a big part of my life. My mother is my hero. So Beyonce too, and Serena Williams as well. So definitely for women, people who grow up in the wrong zip code, like I did in the Bronx or whatever the equivalent would be in their ecosystem. Every group that feels like for whatever reason they're being underestimated and denied access, I feel like it's my privilege to figure out how I can help them.
Wow, it's an incredible thing.
And make a lot of money along the way, because that's the other thing. Everyone's like, "Oh, you're starting a charity." I'm like, "No, actually, it's kind of like Rihanna and Fenty Beauty. There's a huge market of people that feel like I do, or that grew up like I did. We're not a minority. We're the majority of the world's population. All we need is someone that starts focusing on solving our problems and helping us to resolve our needs, and not saying that's kind of irrelevant. Like my life isn't irrelevant just because of my skin color or my sexual orientation. And there are loads of people who have some sort of deficiency. And my job is to say, if we combine all the people together, we're like 99% of the world's population. Let's create products for us.
Yeah. It's incredible. I ended Anna's interview. She was telling me how she'd like to create a kind of hacker's guide for young women to how to live in the fast lane, or what the rules of the game are. And there are some rules, and you need to learn how to follow those rules and say the right thing and not say the wrong thing. And you just resonated. You just repeated that message, which is fascinating. Final question, Gary, because obviously I'm conscious of time, and thank you so much for talking to us. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. But final question: if you could go back to that, you aged 18 years old, knowing what you know now, with all your travels and where you've been. I'm really hoping this podcast series is something that can be picked up by younger people who maybe aren't listening to people who are saying you're great and go for it, and maybe don't have that confidence. What would your, I won't repeat your age, but what would your today age person say to your 18-year-old self? What do you wish you'd known then that you know now?
That there is no such thing as a safe job, and it's better for you to just do what you love. You're usually going to be more successful doing that than doing what other people think you should be doing, or what you think is a safe thing to do. So just figure out what you love and do it, and success will follow. And even if it doesn't, figure out why it didn't, and then pivot, iterate, and then maybe in the second go round or the third go round, it will happen, but it definitely will not happen if you're not doing what you love, or if you don't know what you really want, what you were really put on this earth to do.
Fantastic. Gary Stewart, you're a legend. Thank you so much for your time today. I know this podcast is going to mean a whole load to a whole load of people, and you've been brilliant. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much.